Okay, so I'm going to formally start the webinar now. My name is Dr. Danielle Pollock, and I am the host of this webinar. The webinar we're talking about today is big picture reviews. What are they, and how can we tell them apart? Now, we have an absolutely phenomenal panel today. We have Associate Professor Hanan Khalil from La Trobe University. We have Dr. Fiona Campbell from Newcastle University, and Dr. Ashrita Saran from Campbell Collaboration. Now, all of us are actually part of a group called Navigate, which is a collaboration between Campbell Collaboration and JBI. And we're trying to work out what are big picture reviews, what are the differences. And big picture reviews for us are scoping reviews, mapping reviews, and evidence and gap maps. So we're really hoping to have some great conversation today. Now, before I continue, I do want to do an acknowledgement of country. Now, I know that we're on many different lands today, but the land that JBI sits on is of the Kaurna people. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are participating in this webinar today. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connection to the lands and waters of Australia, but to anywhere else in the lands as well that you are from. So before I keep continuing, just a bit of what will happen today. We have Hanan, who will be starting off first. Then we'll go to Fiona and then Ashrita, and then we'll be answering all your questions today. So, Hanan, I am going to stop sharing my slides. Are you able to share your slides now? Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect.
Excellent. All right. Thanks very much, Danielle, for this lovely introduction. So as Danielle mentioned, I'll be covering the big picture reviews, just a little bit of introduction about them. And then my colleagues will talk a little bit more about them and their importance in the evidence synthesis ecosystem. Okay, just a conflict of interest. So I've been part of the JBI methodology group, and also I'm part of the Navigate, which is a collaboration between JBI and Campbell. I'm also part of the JBI Scoping Review Network, and also a member of the grade group. So this presentation has been divided into 4 parts. So what are big picture reviews? We'll also cover the role of big picture reviews in the evidence ecosystem. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between each type of big picture reviews, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and answers. So I'll cover the first part of the webinar today, which is what are big picture reviews. That's a term that you may have come across in the literature. We've just published a paper this year about it. But if not, we'll just talk a little bit about it. But I just would like to just give you a little bit of introduction about where the big picture reviews came from and their importance as well. So evidence synthesis, as you may know, it's been defined broadly as it's a rigorous collection, evaluation and analysis of literature, studies and reports, and it's becoming important to inform decision-making in policy and practice. So to date, we've got more than 48 different types of evidence synthesis approaches described in the literature. And we've seen also an increase in policymakers, funders, government organizations asking for tenders or requests for evidence synthesis products just to meet their the research and policy making, to help them in their policy making, and also to identify missing research in the area. The growth is reflected also on the value of the field of evidence synthesis. So it's becoming more and more important, and I think a lot of policymakers and large organizations have emphasized the value of evidence synthesis, particularly after the pandemic, where there has a huge number of reviews coming up, collect literature regarding efficiency of vaccines, masks, and other interventions as well. Okay, so the need to address broad research questions came from that policymakers and collaborators, researchers wanted to generate evidence beyond effectiveness. So most of the research questions that big picture reviews address mapping or scoping research questions, describing different aspects of interventions, different characteristics of programs. So it's really beyond what a research question of effectiveness could address. As I mentioned before, there is also a need to generate evidence synthesis that's appropriate to different types of audiences, situations and purposes. And we've seen the increase in funding from organizations wanting to researchers to engage researchers in evidence synthesis products. If you are familiar with this topic, you may have seen that there has been a huge number of publications in the last 10 to 12 years addressing scoping reviews, mapping reviews, and other big picture reviews as well. So why terminology matters? So when we talk about big picture reviews, it's important to know exactly which products we are talking about, because the terminology will determine their indexing and the wider dissemination. We've just finished a piece of work on mapping reviews, and we found that there was a huge variety in the terminologies that people called mapping reviews. They were actually researchers included things like from even systematic reviews, scoping reviews, umbrella reviews, and other types of reviews were considered in our research work as big picture reviews. So what are big picture reviews? So as Danielle mentioned, this presentation of this webinar will focus on scoping reviews, mapping reviews, and evidence gap maps. You may be familiar with some of these, but all of them address broad big picture questions. They all done in a systematic, transparent way. They all have guided methodologies, data extraction and data analysis. They all driven by protocol, and they are all supported by methodological guidance. They all also include different types of evidence or focus on one type of evidence. The included evidence is not synthesized or pulled in any way, but it's usually described narratively, or some of the data is presented in a numerical way. So this is my section of the webinar, and I'll hand over to Ashrita, who will talk a little bit more in detail about the different types of reviews that we have here.
Thank you, Hanan, for taking us through what big picture reviews are. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about what are the role of big picture reviews in the evidence ecosystem. So again, resonating to what Hanan just mentioned, all of these big picture reviews, they have a shared objective. That is, they address a broader research question rather than addressing narrow research question that systematic reviews do. And by addressing these broader research questions, what they're also helping us to do is they help us include multiple dimensions into our research questions. And these multiple dimensions could be in the form of multiple interventions, could be in the form of multiple outcomes, or could be in the form of type of study designs. And by addressing such broad topics, they serve 4 critical roles in the evidence ecosystem for us. The first important one is knowledge translation. So by being so broad in their nature, they support the broad research questions and objectives, thereby helping us identify the trend in research, helping us identify what are the common patterns in research, and also helping us identify where exactly are the key gaps in the research, and what are the key emerging themes in a particular sector or a subsector. I'll take you through an example of this in my subsequent slide. The second important role that these big picture reviews plays is guiding the future research priorities. And they do so by providing a foundation and helping identify where exactly are the key gaps in research, and also helping identify where exactly is the areas of evidence concentration. So this is one of the critical areas or critical role of big picture reviews in the evidence ecosystem. Another important area and an important role that all of these big picture reviews play is informing policy decisions. What is important to note here is that even though all of these big picture reviews, they do not synthesize the evidence for us, but what they help us is they provide an overview of the existing literature on a topic. And whenever we talk about policy decisions, one of the asks by the policy makers or the policy decision makers is to identify what is available out there. And by providing that broader picture of a topic, that so much literature is available on a particular topic, they do help in informing policy decisions. Importantly, some of these big picture reviews also helps collate the evidence together in the form of user links that could be easily accessible to the policymakers to see what kind of research is available on a particular topic. And fourth important critical role that these big picture reviews play is they are also the first step in building evidence architecture. I'll show you in the subsequent slide what I mean about these evidence architecture. But for example, whenever we talk about policy or decision making, these could be made through some of the more curated evidence synthesis products, which are called as decision-making products, such as guidance, checklist, and online decision-making tool. And all of these big picture reviews are actually the stepping stone towards generating these decision-making tools for us. So let's take a quick example on the knowledge translation. So even though all of these big picture reviews, they talk about knowledge translation and help us use the evidence, they are different in certain ways, for example, in how they address the research questions. For example, when we talk about scoping reviews, the research questions, they are mostly open-ended in them. They are more exploratory in nature. When we talk about mapping reviews or evidence and gap map, the research questions, they are more closed-ended. So let's take an example of artificial intelligence in healthcare and see how the aiming for these research questions will depend upon the type of approaches that we use. So for example, if you're using scoping reviews, the aim for the scoping reviews for this particular research topic could be to identify research that examine how AI is used in healthcare settings, the type of AI that have been used, and the ethical consideration associated with its use. Similarly, if we use mapping reviews approach for this particular topic, it may help identify the relationship between the artificial intelligence and the healthcare research by mapping out existing studies on the topic, their key themes, and any relationship between them. Similarly, if you decide to go ahead with evidence and gap map, they might help in aim to explore both substantive and methodological characteristics of existing impact evaluation and systematic reviews for AIs in healthcare research, and also help identify where exactly are the existing gaps in available evidence. So this is just a very quick example of how the aims for each of these big picture review product will differ when we try and use them in practice. Now, coming upon to the second role, which is to guide the future research priorities. Like I mentioned, since we are exploring a very broad research, what we will get when we do these kinds of research is areas of evidence concentration in the form of impact evaluations or systematic reviews. So if you have identified areas of evidence concentration in the impact evaluation, these big picture reviews can help provide more detailed mapping or systematic reviews that could be usefully commissioned on those areas of evidence concentration. Similarly, they can also help us identify areas of evident gaps that can aid in planning and commissioning of future research in the form of impact evaluation, as well as in the form of future evidence synthesis. They also help and can be used to inform program designs or funding decisions for programmer research. Now, for example, there are areas of good impact evaluation or rigorous impact evaluation on a topic. So these rigorous impact evaluation can help us inform the program designs for a particular country or a context, because they help us collate the information together. Similarly, they can also help us have funding decisions. For example, there are key gaps or critical gaps in research in a particular topic. So these big picture reviews can help us direct towards those gaps where the funding and the investments can be made. The snapshot that you see here on the screen on the right-hand side is basically a snapshot for an evidence and gap map on violence against children. Now, evidence and gap map, they help visualize the evidence together for us. So as you can see on the screen, the areas that I've highlighted in green, it shows areas of evidence concentration. The areas that are highlighted in red, it shows areas of evidence gaps. So you can see that in a very visually, appealing way, we can identify where exactly are the key gaps and in the research and where are the areas of evidence concentration. Like I mentioned earlier, they also help us inform policy decisions because policymakers, all of these big picture review, they have importance for policymakers as, like I mentioned earlier, they cover the breadth of science on a topic or a sector, which are often needed in a policy decision. And even though they do not help synthesize the evidence for us, but they can provide ready links to research papers and user summaries, they can also provide ready references in the form of descriptive reports that could be later on looked at and for policy decisions and research decisions. The snapshot that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, again, is from an evidence and gap map, and you can see that it provides a link to the user summary and the link to the research paper. So it's a very readily available form through which you can explore the various resources that is available on a particular topic or research. There are a lot of ways, in scoping reviews as well, where a visually appealing way have been used. Similarly, for mapping reviews, like using bibliometric analysis to see what is the breadth and science of research on a particular topic or area. Importantly, and this is my final slide, so they also the stepping stone in building the evidence architecture. So what you see on the left-hand side of the screen is something that we call as evidence architecture. That basically tells you how these different evidence products they are used and they are stepped together on an evidence pyramid. What is critical here is that we can only get evidence into use by making evidence available for evidence-based decision-making products like checklist, guidelines, and evidence portal, which you see on the top of the evidence pyramid. But that cannot be fulfilled unless you fill the bottom of the pyramid. And I think evidence maps, scoping reviews, and mapping reviews, they are the critical link between the top of the pyramid and to the bottom of the pyramid, because they help us explore the literature that are available in the form of how much evidence is there, where exactly are the key gaps, and sometimes in some of the areas also help us identify what are the confidence and findings of those research. So they are really critical in terms of building the evidence architecture and getting evidence into use together. And by saying so, we can just mention that whenever you do big picture reviews, they are not an end in themselves, but of course, they're a step towards building the future works, which is what we are trying to do as researchers by getting our evidence into use. And I think big picture reviews play a critical role here in the evidence ecosystem. I'm going to stop here and hand over to Fiona to take us through the next section of the presentation.
So thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to join you today. And in the section I'm going to be covering now, I'm going to be looking in a little bit more detail in how we understand the differences and some of the proposals that we're making to support how you work out whether it's a scoping review, a mapping review, or when an evidence gap map might be most appropriate. Just that I have no actual or potential conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. So I just want to say a little bit about my journey and how I became particularly interested in this type of methodology. For many years, I've been undertaking systematic reviews that synthesize either quantitative or qualitative evidence, sometimes mixed method synthesis, but ended up in response to the types of research questions that I've been asked to look at and the objectives of the research, using scoping, mapping, and evidence gap map methodologies across a wide range of different topic areas. And I've just put up 3 examples to illustrate the diversity of topic areas that I was exploring using these different methodologies. Every time that I undertook one of these reviews, I found that I was exploring, along with my team, is this a scoping review? Is this a mapping review? Or should this be an evidence gap map? And I'm just wondering, perhaps some people could put in the chat whether that resonates with you and your own experiences, but it wasn't straightforward to know. The important question to think about is whether that matters, and Hanan touched on this in her presentation. Does it matter if there's different terminology being used? Well, I would argue that it does. Hanan mentioned the issue of indexing, and of course that's really important when we're trying to locate evidence. But it may be that there's different expectations, which makes reviews difficult to commission and deliver. Peer review process become more complicated and potentially unresolvable. And in fact, it was my role as an editor in Campbell that prompted me to pursue this, because I realized that we needed to be giving our reviewers support with, and at least be consistent in the advice that we were giving. Editors can't agree on publishability. Readers cannot benchmark review quality. There may be inappropriate criteria used in evaluation, and and these are not a basis for reliable decision making. So in terms of research methods, it's really important that we have an agreed nomenclature. And when I started to explore the literature around these different methodologies, I found that there was a lot of inconsistency within the literature. So there would be examples where scoping and mapping reviews, for example, were given different definitions. They were seen as different things. And yet in other literature, the terms scoping and mapping was used interchangeably. And when I looked at examples of these types of reviews, it was quite clear that there was no answer in that either, because what was sometimes described as a mapping review looked a bit like a scoping review, and vice versa. And sometimes you'd have a scoping review that mapped the literature and a mapping review that scoped the literature. And really, there was no clarity in what I was seeing in the literature either. And that led through just conversations, that the formation of our Navigate group, and joining other colleagues with expertise in this area. And it was really the result of lots of discussion and thinking, and trying to think about how we could propose a framework to help define what are the differences and what under which heading this type of review should sit, but using this sort of family group heading of big picture reviews as a sort of umbrella term for all of them. And Danielle put out a lovely tweet, which I think encapsulates what we try to do in this paper, which what happens when a scoping review, mapping review, and evidence gap map walk into a bar. They try to work out their differences. And that's exactly what this paper was a result of. And in that paper, we created a little a diagram where we tried to identify what these types of reviews have in common, but also where they begin to become separate in their approach. And JBI and Danielle took that forward and created a really beautiful infographic. And I'm just going to use that in this presentation now. And I'm going to start by looking at the end, because I think that's where one of the clearest difference is easier to see. Ashrita's already illustrated and shown you an evidence gap map, but this is where there's a very obvious difference between an evidence gap mapping review and a scoping review, because an evidence gap map has this very distinctive visual, interactive, online-based output. But the other thing about that, and again, Ashrita alluded to this, is that it starts with this pre-formed, during protocol stage, developed with extensive consultation with your stakeholders, a matrix. And one of the features of an evidence gap map, I think it's the best methodology and the most rigorous methodology for identifying gaps and for being able to describe those gaps, because you don't start with the evidence, you start with the matrix. And onto the matrix, you plot your evidence. If you started with the evidence, you wouldn't be able to locate your maps. And I don't know if any of you have worked on projects where you felt that one of the gaps that was located in your review was the research that the PI wanted to undertake next. So I think an evidence gap map is probably our most objective way of identifying gaps for future research. And in fact, one of the things that we did with one of the evidence gap maps we produced was used it. We then went back to our stakeholders and said, here are the gaps. And then we undertook 2 systematic reviews, informed very much by the gaps that were identified in the evidence and gap map. So this is an example of an evidence gap map that I worked on. And just to talk a little bit about this matrix again, because that might be new to some of you. So when we talk about matrix, we talk about this framework here, the column and row headings. And in this particular evidence gap map, our column headings were our outcomes. We looked at outcomes relevant to younger people and older people. The interventions we were interested in were intergenerational interventions, and we were looking at their impact on children, older people, and also societal impact. And then our row headings was using a scale actually that was suggested to us by our stakeholders, and it's the Kaplan's levels of intergenerational practice, and it reflects the depth of the intervention. So that was the framework that we used. And you can also see in evidence gap map, you have these dots which indicate the size, indicates the quantity of evidence, but and at the bottom of the map you'll have that will give you an indication of what the colours in that cell indicate. And what the other feature of an evidence gap map is that we create filters which allows you to explore the evidence and be able to locate, for example, if you wanted to find all of the evidence that had been undertaken in a particular country, depending on the coding framework. In this particular map, we looked at the different types of focus of those interventions. So that was one of our filters. The reason I'm describing this is because actually it also highlights one of the other differences, and that's in the type of data that we're extracting. So in an evidence gap map, in a mapping review, we're often pre-specifying our categories, that they will be discrete categories and the data will be coded into them. For an evidence gap map, we'll develop a coding tool, and if we're creating the map in EpiMapper, it will be a coding tool in EpiReviewer, but we have very defined categories. It means that the type of data that we're extracting in a mapping review and an evidence gap map is what we call high level, or a surface view, if you like. Whereas in a scoping review, often the type of data may have more depth to it. And of course, this will relate to the scope of the question. So here's an example of the types of data that may be coded in a mapping review and an evidence gap map. And that's not to say this won't be captured in a scoping review, it will be. But you can see that this is quite high level data, quite easily captured by looking at the data, and can also crucially be done really quite quickly. The next slide I'm going to show you is a slide which I'm just going to release that. So this is some of the descriptions that I've taken directly from guidance around undertaking scoping reviews. So I'm just going to go through. So charting or coding should be considered an iterative process in which researchers continually update the data charting form. Now, as I've just mentioned, in mapping reviews and evidence gap maps, we don't have an iterative process. Certainly in evidence gap map, you start with this pre-formed matrix and you have a defined coding tool. In scoping reviews, to chart and summarize complex concepts in a meaningful way. Synthesizing process information may benefit from utilization of qualitative content analysis approaches to make sense of the wealth of extracted data. The analytical stage may resemble qualitative data and analytical techniques. So I think that really nicely begins to indicate some of these differences in the types of approach that might be used in a scoping review, which might be much more explorative, might be dealing with much more complex levels of data that are being extracted, and they might need to be described in slightly different ways. And so what you can see in the infographic there, this idea that scoping reviews may be more inductive in their approach and in their exploration of the included studies. here's just one example of a type of scoping review where the data, it isn't coded, there's textual data that's extracted and that's grouped, categorized and described. I just wanted to mention this paper. It's a lovely paper which describes this process. Quite often these sort of details are not what's in the published report. So this is just a really nice where they talk about the informal judgments and negotiations that go on during a scoping review, and the authors describe it like a dance, and it's a really nice paper that I'd recommend you look at. And of course, the type of data that is being extracted and the way that's looked at, categorized, also has implications for the time resource needed. And so evidence gap maps will generally have quite a large number of studies included. The evidence gap map that I've just shown you that we did on intergenerational interventions had 500 studies in it. Whereas if you're doing something much more in depth, a scoping review will have far fewer studies in it. Now, one of the things just to remind you of is that almost what we've done here is we've presented a way potentially of going forwards. If you look back at published examples, you won't find this. In a sense, this is quite a new proposal. It's what we think made sense in terms of a way of supporting reviewers thinking about whether this is scoping review and mapping review, and whether an evidence gap map would be the most appropriate approach. What we see at the moment, I think quite often, is the term scoping review, mapping review, often used interchangeably. And what we're and these two are probably the ones where identifying distinct differences is a little bit harder. As I mentioned, an evidence gap map has this very clear visual interactive output. And what we're suggesting is that there are ways going forwards where we can think that scoping reviews have some distinct qualities that are different to mapping reviews. But inevitably, there is a little bit of overlap, and quite often it may well be that a review starts off perhaps with an intention that maybe the reviewers think actually will be a mapping review, but actually becomes a scoping review. So I think that that's an area where there's perhaps less complete distinction, but nevertheless, I think the guidance we've put in that infographic helps to illustrate at least some of the differences that there might be in these types of approaches. Just to conclude, the existing literature is inconsistent. We have aimed to create a framework that helps locate your approach within this family of big picture reviews, and we really would value your feedback and your comments to the work that we've undertaken. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all of our panelists. We have tried to leave, as I said, a lot of time for questions. So I just want to ask, if you have your questions, can you please put them in the Q&A box now? Currently we have none, but I'm hoping we'll have some more. So the very first question that we've actually had is something about software. And I just want to make sure that I think we're all using the same software, but I want to make sure that I've not missed anything. So Fiona, what software do you use to be able to create those wonderful interactive maps?
So for the maps I've used EpiReviewer and EpiMapper. There was one map that I created, and in fact it was before EpiReviewer and EpiMapper were available. And I know that 3IE do have produced some software, but in fact I find the EpiReviewer and EpiMapper software very, very easy to use, partly also because it supports other processes in the systematic review process. So, for example, you can manage your screening and the development of your coding tool and so on with an EpiReviewer. What I did with one review actually is I worked with some computer students who were doing a secondment, and they created a bespoke tool for one of the EGMs we created, but that obviously it wasn't transferable to other reviews, and ever since then I've used EpiReview and EpiMapper, which I just find incredibly adaptable for the different types of evidence gap maps I've worked on.
Hanan, I was wondering what you've got your hand up. What program do you use?
Danielle, I actually haven't. I use Verse Viewer, and I just want to draw people's attention that there is a paper coming up about the evidence mapping reviews, and we looked at 80 different mapping reviews, and most of them have used either Verse Viewer, EpiReviewer, or EpiMapper, RStudio, JNMs, and Microsoft PowerPoint in some of them as well. So that's going to be detailed in the paper that's coming up soon, hopefully.
Yeah. So Ashrita, I think you also put something, another program within the chat, but I realized that might have actually not gone to our attendees. So can you just tell me a bit about that one?
Oh, okay, sure. So I think we have been using EpiMapper for a very long time, and I think that is a preference for us for one of the important reasons that it enables machine learning. So for example, if you're working on an evidence and gap map that needs regular updating, I think EpiMapper should be the software of choice, because you can actually link it back to the machine learning for searching as well. For example, it is linked to OpenLX, which is a very, very comprehensive platform for searching the different databases and searching the literature. So that is one of the importance of using EpiMapper. Another one is what 3i uses. That is not public, but it is a software called as Nova, which is, again, if you have seen 3i maps, you can see that they are really very good in terms of the color, coordination, and all of that. So it's, again, has similar functionalities, but I'm not too sure about whether it includes machine learning, which I am sure it doesn't, because EpiMapper is, it's like an online tool, but it is linked back to the coding tool, which is called as EpiReviewer. So that's have been the preference.
Thank you. We have received one question, and that's if we as a team could differentiate these three in an epistemological way, such as their role in contributing to knowledge evidence, and if so, can you elaborate? So who would like to say the difference in the epistemology of these three different reviews? Fiona, we did kind of touch a little bit on that, didn't we, in our paper? So I might talk to you.
Yeah, okay. So I think that one of the things that we did see, and I think it perhaps is illustrated quite nicely in those quotes that I gave you, is that certainly in terms of the roots of scoping reviews, I think they tend to have much more an interpretist and a qualitative roots. Whereas I think certainly the mapping review approach is, I think the whole nature of being able to categorize things and so on suggests it's slightly more positivist, but you know, we also, I suppose all of these approaches feel much more sort of from a critical realist epistemology. I find it, you know, I think there are particular challenges when you're trying to sort of categorize qualitative studies. We have done it in evidence gap maps and mapping reviews, but often just to say that they're there. I tend to find that if I'm looking at qualitative studies, I'm generally looking at a more of a scoping approach. I don't know if that's answered the question.
Hanan or Ashrita, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, Danielle, just, I mean, when we talk about epistemology, it's not just the interpretation or the origin of the knowledge, but it's also about the method, validity, and scope. And as both Fiona and Ashrita mentioned, the three methods that we've introduced to everybody today is really, they all have got a defined scope. They've all have got methodology, guidance, and a way of reporting in the PRISMA scoping review extensions as well. Evidence gap maps, from my understanding, Ashrita has developed that, and her and I think her colleague from Campbell, they've published the paper on that a couple of years ago. So they do have valid methods, they do have a defined scope, but I mean, as Fiona mentioned, there is still a lot of confusion in some of them, and as also I've mentioned, the paper that will be hopefully coming up soon, it will shed some light on the different types of methodologies that people have been using in mapping reviews as well.
Ashrita?
Yeah, sure. So I just want to add, a few things here that, when we talk about evidence and gap map, and when we talk about epistemologically, the maps are rooted with the belief that knowledge can be organized to identify the current understanding and areas that require further exploration. So their main basis is to provide a comprehensive overview of available knowledge and highlighting areas where research is completely lacking. When we talk about scoping reviews and mapping reviews, they also help to recognize that knowledge is situated in a larger context, and they also help in understanding the breadth and depth of existing research is essential. So sometimes, for example, if we talk about mapping reviews, that also helps us understand that knowledge is not static and it is continuously evolving within a specific domains of the field, and mapping reviews and scoping reviews help us explore that field in a more in-depth way. Sometimes through using some of the techniques like, analysis, bibliometric analysis, sometimes also doing some comprehensive analysis for that particular topic and domains.
Thank you. So if we have people, I think you've answered all of that very well. I was just wondering if people are wanting to actually do an evidence and gap map, a mapping review, or a scoping review, what guidance is actually available for them to be able to know how to do that? Now, Ashrita, I'll get you to answer about evidence and gap maps.
So if you want to do an evidence and gap map, we have a guidance paper which is called as Campbell Guidance on Evidence and Gap Map that is available. It's publicly available. It will take you through the different steps that are required to do an evidence and gap map. Importantly, I'll again highlight how to work on the framework, because I think that is the key to doing evidence and gap map. So I think if you have to do, or if you are thinking of doing an evidence and gap map, please go and read that paper, because that will help you highlight how to actually draft your framework. And there are different ways of doing that. So that evidence and gap map guidance paper will take you through that.
Thank you. Fiona, mapping reviews?
So a lot of the guidance for scoping reviews does apply, and Prisma SCR would apply to mapping reviews. But I think there's a really nice paper, which in fact I've got on my slides, a reference to that Katie James and Neil Hadaway wrote specifically for mapping reviews. And I think that's a really nice guidance paper for mapping reviews.
And Hanan, what about scoping reviews?
With scoping reviews, we've got a lot of papers published on guidance of how to do scoping reviews. And the latest one was published in 2021, the updated one. We're actually working on an updated chapter at the moment. This is also in addition to the Prisma Scoping Review Extension reporting guidance for scoping reviews. So there's certainly a lot of resources for on how to do scoping reviews and guidance on how to report them.
So a big question I have now is this is an emerging evidence synthesis, all of these three, maybe not as established as systematic reviews, but becoming very established. So what do we now need to do to be able to improve the future directions of these review types? Anyone like to answer?
I can just add one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Fiona. I think you.
I think we'll probably all start at the same time. Hanan, you started to talk as well.
I think, again, I'd like to refer to the paper that we've just finished doing, which is really about working out to see what people called mapping reviews and thinking about having an updated guidance for the mapping reviews, which I'm hoping that will be coming next year. But I think scoping to see exactly what people are publishing in that space and what they're calling mapping reviews are. I think that's probably a first start. And then maybe going through some of the work that all of us have published regarding mapping reviews and how people are using them for informing policy makers or future research. I think that's probably a good step to look at. But over to you, Ashrita or Fiona, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many areas for development. I mean, I think one of them that's really interesting is how do we involve stakeholders, and I think this is an issue across all types of evidence synthesis, but actually practically, how do we do it? I know Danielle, you've done some work in this area, but I think quite often the way that it's undertaken and how it impacts the review findings is quite poorly reported. So I think we need to get better at doing that. I think that there's interesting questions around how policy users use these types of evidence outputs. Are they principally used by researchers? How are policymakers using it? So better understanding knowledge translation and how we can go about reporting these types of outputs in ways that are really accessible. I think that one of the things, and the purpose of today is to look at some of the confusion around terminology, and it'd be really nice to see some clarity around the use of the terms, because I think that will really support reviewers as they think about the most appropriate guidance. And also it will support people who are in editing roles as well, and also educating roles. So I think some clarity around definitions is another area that things will change and improve.
Yeah. I do also want to say in the chat, if you have areas that you think we need to work on in big picture reviews, please put them in the chat, and that will help us to be able to guide our future priorities, and we're also doing our methodology work. Ashrita, what do you think? What are some future directions we need to do?
I think the one which is a bit broader is bridging the gaps between how policymakers or how decision makers see these big picture reviews into use, because I think systematic reviews are very well established in some of the common organizations like World Health Organization. They do use systematic reviews when they take policy decisions or any decisions. But I think what is missing right now is the importance of big picture reviews being so regularly used by policymakers. So I think that is one area that needs to be worked on. And I think that could be worked on by, having more and more research regarding these big picture reviews that are using the methodological guidance that JBI and all of us, have come up together. Another bridge is, I think, having a common merging, methodology. I think we did discuss it, to have a common area where we can go and identify, if I have to do a research on a topic, which big picture reviews that I could use, is more suited to me. I think we did discuss it. I think that if, something like that to be developed would help a lot of researchers ease out their confusion between what should be used in terms of researchers. So I think these two.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am so glad that we were able to do this. As I said, highlighting that this is coming from a paper that all of us have collaborated on, as well as some others, experts who couldn't be here today. But please go to that resource. And also I'd like to highlight the JBI Scoping Review Network, which has all the scoping review resources available, and also go to Campbell Collaboration to be able to access all the evidence and gap map resources as well. So I just want to finish on a few more slides. I really just want to thank you all for attending. We do this because we want to help as many people as possible in methods and make it an easy approach. So if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to email us. We'll be happy to answer. We can do that through our JBI Scoping Review Network contact page, and we are happy to pass that on to our experts here to be able to assist you in any way. Now, to be able to better ourselves, we do have an evaluation that will come out through an email soon. So please fill that in, as we'd like to know how we can best provide this information to you all. So also some other resources, jbi.global, that is the JBI webpage. It has so many jam-packed resources on methods and our global collaboration. So please go there. And also our YouTube page, as we have a lot of how-tos on that JBI YouTube page as well. So please go there as well if you'd like to know more about the methods work that we do. And finally, I'm so excited. We are actually presenting this work in a little bit more detail at JBI Ignite, and that is going to be held in Adelaide from the 16th to the 17th of November this year. So if you happen to be able to come to Adelaide around that time, Adelaide is an amazing state to visit. Please come to JBI Ignite. We would love to see you. And it is a conference that is able to talk about all things methods, which is my favourite discussion. And we are talking about big picture reviews in that. So again, thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much, Hanan, Fiona and Ashrita. I very much appreciate your time and effort in this. And we'll end the webinar here.